Hello again. In the previous online lecture, I showed you how to do a standard frequency table in Excel. So in this lecture, I'll show you how to do a grouped or an interval frequency table in Excel. Just like before, you will find two files below. One is a data spreadsheet, and the other is a step-by-step direction document on making a interval frequency table in Excel. This document is exactly the same as the one that was in the previous online lecture, except now we're going to continue through the standard frequency table into the interval or group frequency table. And so we'll go through the first steps fairly quickly because those are the same as in the last video, and we'll focus more on the steps that are unique to a interval frequency table. So just like before, I'm going to share my screen. So here I have my spreadsheet that I've opened up, and I have the directions document as well. And again, I'm not making them full screen. I'm making them partial screen so I can go back and forth between the two fairly easy. The first thing that you want to do whenever you open a spreadsheet is you want to take a look at your data, make sure that you understand the variables that you're working with. In this case, we still have our very first column of participant ID. We have a new variable, in this case called coffee. And if you hover over that label, you'll see that the values represent dollars spent on coffee. So 6 would be $6, 35 would be $35. You also want to scroll through your data. You just want to take a look at it and notice here that there is a blank cell. So again, this is data that came from a previous semester. We see that one of the students decided not to answer this question for whatever reason, or maybe they missed a question or skipped it, whatever it may be. And so for what we're going to do today, this blank cell right here isn't going to matter, but in future analyses, having a blank cell in the middle of your data will cause some problems. And so we're going to go ahead and sort this column, and we're going to push this blank cell down to the bottom. That way we're prepared. So if we ever want to do like z-scores, or if we wanted to do a randomizing of the values, that we wouldn't have that blank cell in there that would mess up our results. So to sort your column, to push blank cells down to the bottom, we'll want to make sure that we're on the Home tab. We'll want to make sure we highlight our column that has our data in it. So I'll just left click on the column header, in this case B, so not on the label, but on the B column. And then I'm going to go across the top here. I'm going to find the icon that says Sort and Filter. I'm going to left click on that icon, and I'm going to either sort smallest to largest or largest to smallest. It doesn't really matter, just whatever your preference is. I prefer smallest to largest. So we'll click that icon, and notice that it's going to give you this dialog box, and it's a warning. And what it's saying is, do you want to just sort the column that you highlighted, or do you want to expand the selection? In this case, we want to expand the selection. What that's going to do is going to keep all of our rows intact. So when I sort column B, I want column A to sort with it, so that this $35 is still paired with participant number 5. So as a general rule, you always want to expand the selection. I can't think of a time in this class, at least, that I'll just want to sort the column by itself. But if I did just want to sort column B and not sort column A, I would click continue with the current selection. That's not what we want here. We want to make sure we expand the selection. And because it's so common, expand the selection is the typical default whenever you sort. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and click the sort button. And notice that my values in the coffee variable are now going from the smallest value of $0 spent all the way up to, it looks like $76 is the highest value spent. And notice that our blank cells pushed down here, so participant 70 is still sorted with that blank cell and is now at the bottom. So if I was ever going to randomize my values or create z-scores, or any other transform with my data, then I can make sure I don't include that very last cell, as that would mess up my results. You'll also notice that because column A was sorted with column B, that our participant IDs are no longer in numerical order. They're kind of jumbled up a little bit, and that's because of the sorting process. We've sorted both columns based on column B. All right, so the very last thing that we want to look at here is always check your code book. So we know we're talking about coffee. We know what's in terms of dollars spent on coffee, but dollars spent in what length of time? Is that in a day? Is that in a week? Is that in a month? So we want to take a look at our code book here and get the actual question that was asked of participants. And here we see the question was, on average, how much do you spend on coffee per week? And so all these values in that data tab represent dollars spent in a week. So several students don't spend any. And it looks like one student spends about $76 on coffee in a week. All right, so even though we sorted it, and notice that by sorting it, we actually can understand the values better, but there's still quite a few values here. And so we're going to want to summarize this into a table so that we can understand it a little bit better. It's much easier to see a table with 7 to 10 intervals than it is to look at, in this case, some 79 or 78 values just by scrolling through it. Let's take a look at our Word document for our directions, and you'll notice it's the same Word document, the same directions as it was for a standard frequency table. We'll go through the same steps, but a little bit quicker this time, and we'll focus on steps 5 and 6 in this video. So first off, we want to indicate what type of frequency table we would like to create. We did a standard frequency table before, but let's talk about group frequency table. So here we want intervals or ranges of values. So we're going to choose a group frequency table when we have more than 10 values of equal widths. In this case, we can see our lowest value is 0, our highest value is 76, all of equal widths, and that's quite a wide range. And so we don't want 76 values with counts next to each one. We want to create ranges so that it's easier for us to understand and interpret the data. So we talked about Miller's Magic 7 in the online lecture, in the narrated PowerPoint lecture. And so we want to condense this down to about 7 to 10 rows of data that we can summarize and understand in a glance without having to think too hard about it. So in this case, we're going to do a group frequency table. We're going to group these values within smaller ranges. Let's go back to our Word document with the directions. And so I mentioned before, in this case, steps 1, 2, 3, and 4 are going to be the same as before. There are some changes in step 5. So I'm going to quickly go through our steps here because we've seen this already. So the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to go up to my Insert tab, click Pivot Table. I want to select my data. In this case, I just want column B, so I'm going to highlight inside that field there in the dialog box, and then I'm going to left-click on column B. That'll highlight all my data. And then I want to put my table in my existing worksheet. And again, I'm going to move it a few columns away from my data in case I ever have to do any kind of transforms or sorting or anything like that. I don't want to mess up my table. So here I'm going to put it in, we'll put it in the same one, we'll put G3. So again, column G, row 3. Click OK. And so now I can select my variable. In this case, it's coffee. And notice again that my default on my Excel is placing that variable in the sum of values column. The typical default will place it in rows, but that's okay. Just remember that you want that variable once in rows and twice in sum of values. So now if I look at my table, you'll see I have quite a few different values in there. It certainly would be a lot easier if these were put into intervals or ranges, and so that's our goal here, so we don't have so many rows. We want between 7 and 10 rows. Not the number of rows that we have currently here for each of those values. So let's go back to our Word document. We have our 3 columns. So we're down here in step 4. We are going to go ahead and right click on that second column. We're going to summarize the values by count. And then we're also going to show the percent to grand total in that third column. So let's go back to our spreadsheet. And then we're going to go to our very first label for our column. And I will right click. And I want to summarize my values by count. Now notice up here that in our third column, it still says sum. We want that to be count. So we're going to summarize values by count there as well. Now we want to turn that last column into a percent. So we're going to go down to shows values as percent of grand total. And so now I have each of my values. I have a count for each of those values, and I have the percentage, the overall percentage of each of those values within my data set. So let's go back to our directions document. Notice we're at step 5 now. We're going to rename each of those columns. Remember, now we have a group frequency table, so we're going to name it intervals. We're still going to call it frequency and percentage in the other two columns. We don't need to worry about the rest of this because the rest of this is for a standard frequency table. We're going to change those headers, and then we're going to jump right to step number 6. So back in our spreadsheet, our very first column we're going to rename. And again, you can just left click on there and you're just going to type. So I'm going to put in intervals. The next label I'm going to name is frequency. And then the last one is going to be our frequency or our frequency percent. So I'm going to put in percentage. All right, so there's the labels of each of our columns in our table. We don't need to worry about the rest of step 5 because we're going to use a group frequency table. And if we were to go through those steps, we would have to undo it for that group or interval frequency table. So everything to this point was the same as a standard frequency table. So let's go ahead and go to our Word document and let's jump to step 6. So in step 6, we're going to group our variable. We're going to create our interval ranges. We're going to right click on the very first value under the first column title, and then we're going to click group, and we're going to indicate where we're going to start at, and that should already be defaulted, and then also where we're going to end at, and that should also be defaulted. What we need to determine is the interval width, and that's why that's highlighted there. So you remember from the narrated PowerPoint, we talked about the interval width. That is the full range of values divided by the intervals. Again, the full range is the max value minus the minimum value plus something, right? And we have to actually calculate that. Excel won't do that for us, so we'll have to do the math to make sure that we put in the right value there. And then when it comes to the number of intervals, we're going to choose between 7 and 10. In this case, I'm just going to choose 10 just to make it easy, but we could choose 8, we could choose 7, we could choose 9. It doesn't really particularly matter as long as it's within that range of 7 to 10. When it comes to an exam, I will tell you how many intervals that you need to create. That makes it easier for me to grade if everyone's using the same number of intervals. All right, so let's go back to our spreadsheet. So we're going to go to that very first value under the first column. We're going to right click. I'm going to go down till I get to group. My dialog box will pop up, and notice that it already defaults at 0 and 76. That's my lowest value and my highest value. Then we have this column here that says by. So this by tells us how wide each of the intervals or groups should be. Here it's saying 10 units. Now we don't want to use 10 units here. It's probably not going to give us our 10 intervals. So it's tempting to just hit OK here. You don't want to do that. We actually want to calculate the interval width that's going to work with the number of intervals that we want. So we'll need to do a little bit of math here. So remember that our interval width is going to equal the full range divided by the number of intervals. And that's the number of intervals that we want. So in this case, our highest value is 76. Our lowest value is 0, which is convenient. And then we need to add something. And so that something we add will depend on the types of values that we have in our data set. What's nice about Excel is that it doesn't really matter if we put 1 here or not. It does the math for us when it creates those interval rows. And so if we added 1 here, we would be just fine. And then we want to divide by the number of intervals that we want. In this case, we want 10 intervals. So we're going to divide by 10. Now, the only time in Excel that you probably don't want to add 1 is if your values are really, really small. So let's say you had a bunch of decimals, values that are less than, I would say probably less than 10 with some decimals in there, and you wanted to create a group frequency table. And if you added 1, you would add too much. But if you added something like 0.1 or 0.01, then it would probably work. So in that case, it depends on the type of data. I would say if your highest value is 10 or less, then maybe you might want to think about adding something, assuming something less than 1, assuming again that your values are decimals and you have decimals within those values. If you don't have decimals, then and you have your highest value is 10, then just do a standard frequency table. But anything with more than 10 values, I would just go ahead and add 1 and that will work in Excel because it'll do the math for you. If you're doing this by hand, and let's say you had values that are in the hundreds or thousands or tens of thousands, then adding 1 won't be enough. But because Excel handles all the decimals for you, that's not usually a concern. Just add 1, unless you have a bunch of very, very small numbers such as decimals in your data set. So if we look at our math here, so we're going to get 77 divided by 10. That's going to give us 7.7 for interval widths. So we want to replace this 10 in the by field with 7.7. Okay, so we're just going to type in the box here 7.7. Then I'm going to click OK. Notice what that does for us is it groups our data together. So the very first thing you want to do is you want to make sure that you have your 10 intervals here. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. I didn't get 10 intervals. I only got 8, and that can be problematic. So I'll give you a second here. You can take a look at your intervals and try to figure out where those missing intervals are. And if you're looking closely, you're going to notice that there's a big gap between 53 and 69. Maybe some other gaps in there. And that's where our missing intervals are. So we're going to want to get those, and we have some steps to get those here in a little bit. But just notice that we didn't get 10 intervals here. It's not that they're missing. It's just that we don't have them showing in the table. Let's go ahead and go back to our Word document. And notice we're going to scroll down here. So we're still in step 6, but notice that there's some things that we need to do to clean up our table, make it a little bit nicer. So notice that, first of all, and we've mentioned this already, that intervals with frequency counts of 0 will not be automatically shown. So to get those intervals, we need to right-click on the very first value under our first column, and then click on Field Settings. We'll click on the Layout and Print tab. And we're going to check the box Show Items with No Data, and that's going to give us those intervals back. So back to the spreadsheet. So we're going to go under that very first interval in that first column, and we're going to go down to Field Settings. You'll notice that there's some tabs here. We want the Layout and Print tab. We're going to check on the box that says Show Items with No Data. And we'll click OK. And notice that we're now going to get 2 extra intervals that were hidden before. They are there, and if we count our intervals now, we should have 10. So 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, and 10 intervals of values. Just 2 of those intervals have counts of 0, and that's why they weren't showing up before. Now, the problem with that is that we know that these have counts of 0, but they're blank. So we want to make sure that we get a value of 0 in these 2 intervals here. So let's go back to our Word document. You'll see that next point right here. It says right-click on a cell in the pivot table to fill empty cells with the value of 0. So we have some empty cells there. We want zeros in those cells. So we're going to click on the pivot table options. We'll click on Layout and Format tab, and we're going to enter 0 in for the empty cells. So back in our spreadsheet, we'll right-click on that very first interval. We'll go down to Pivot Table Options. Want to make sure we're on the Layout and Format tab, which we are. And notice down here, we have this check box that says for empty cells, show. So we want to indicate what we want to put in those empty cells. In this case, we're going to put a 0. So I'll type in 0, and I will click OK. And notice that now all those empty cells have a 0 in them, so it accurately reflects the frequency of the values that are contained within each of these intervals. So we know we have 25 values between 7.7 and 15.4, 4 between 21.1 and 30.8, and then of course 0 between 53.9 and 61.6. Let's go back to our Word document. So next, we'll need to hide the interval cells that have frequency counts of 0 if they're the first or last interval. So our very first and our very last interval needs to have a frequency count in it. If it doesn't, then it's not needed. Now, intervals in between the first and last can have counts of 0, just not the first one and the last one. So we're going to do the same thing that we did with the standard frequency table. We're going to click on Filter, then we'll click on Hide Selected, and that's going to get rid of those rows that have the word blank in them. So back to our spreadsheet, we'll right-click, go down to Filter. We want to hide selected items. So it's going to hide that row for the first row. And then we're going to go to this very last row. Again, it has a frequency count of 0. I want to hide this row. It's not adding any value to my table. So I'll right click, go to filter, hide selected items. And now I'm left with just the 10 intervals that I am interested in. Of course, I'm not done yet, but I'm getting a lot closer. We're almost finished here. So let's go back to our Word document. We do need to adjust the interval widths to remove overlap. We go back to our spreadsheet. You'll notice that we have 7.7 in two places. We have it in the very first row, and we also have it in the second row. That's not good because when it comes to our viewer who's looking at our table, they're going to wonder, if I had a value of 7.7 in my data set, which row would it be falling in? And the answer is going to fall into this second row where it starts and not this first row. So we want to be a little bit clearer here. And so what we're going to do is we're going to replace that second value in that interval range with something slightly smaller. So if we go back to our Word document, notice that we're going to adjust the last number to be slightly smaller than the first. All right, so let's take a look at a very first interval. Now you will have to do this interval by interval, but once you select the interval, you can come up to the function bar. I'm just going to hit backspace. I'm going to type in 69. So instead of being 7.7, we're going to say that this interval ends at 7.69. And it's understood that this would be repeating. So 7.6999999 all the way to infinity. We'll go to the next interval. We'll do the same thing. So instead of a 4, we're going to put 39. Instead of 1 here, we're going to put 09. Instead of 8, 0.79. Instead of 0.50, we'll put 49, so on and so forth. And that way there's no confusion on our table where our values are falling within their interval widths. So this last one, 77, we want to be slightly less than 77, so we're going to say 76.99. And now all of our intervals have equal widths. They're not overlapping. We have values in the first and the last interval. We have our frequency count, and we have our frequency percentage. So those are the things that we're looking for when it comes to grading. So if our interval widths are a little bit different, that's okay. This as long as you're meeting the criteria of equal interval widths and that you have counts in the first and last interval, you have your frequencies and your percentages correct, so on and so forth. And that's what you're graded on when it comes to the table that you submit. So we're almost finished here. The last thing we need to do is give the table a title, just like we did with the standard frequency table. We'll click on that cell right above the title. And in this case, we'll say group frequency table. Of students spending on coffee. So that's it. That's a group frequency table. Please remember to save your spreadsheet with your name as the file name and submit below in the submit file question.